All right, let's do it.
Hello and welcome to another episode, another season, if you will. This is the same intro I did last time. Uh, of The Devil We Know. Number 4, like the number of letters in the name of God.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought you were going to introduce yourself, so I just.
Starring me, Juliet.
And also me, Kavita.
The premise of the show is, as always, that there's a lot of different experiences in the world, and we each have our own.
Juliet's being one with Christianity and mine being with this game.
Mm-hmm.
Over the course of this series, we've learned so much about each other's experiences with devils of all kinds.
Yeah. So, there's something interesting to be said about a space where you go through multiple routes of something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what that means over time for a work when you don't just experience a single ending, but multiple endings to something. So Kavi, can you tell me a little bit about Nier Automata?
I would love to tell you a little bit about Nier Automata. You play a robot with silver hair who is soft flirting with another robot with silver hair while you kill a bunch of other alien robots. And I don't really understand how many, to be clear, I don't know much about this game, and I haven't played very much of it. I've played 3 hours, maybe. But if you unplug your OS chip from your robot body, you get one ending, and possibly you can get more endings. And listener, for the record, Juliet mentioned that they had a very funny bit, and I want you to know the fear I lived in for the brief moment when they said, "Can you tell me about?" And I sat there and thought, is this going to be Homestuck?
Oh, okay. I mean, at least we're not asking you about reincarnation, right?
Oh God.
I gotta say the idea of these two robots flirting with each other and fighting a bunch of stuff sounds pretty compelling to me.
Uh-huh.
A lot of the games I've been watching people play lately are much less compelling than that. But, since the last time we recorded, I'm gonna shill something since hi listener, you're watching this here. I wrote and released a visual novel.
Yeah.
That's not on the topic. I mean, there's no killing robots in that one. So you can go find, just like Mousewife Games is this YouTube channel, you can find Mousewife Games on itch.io and download for free a game called Labor Information Knowledge Echolocation. It's a fun, short visual novel that you might like if you enjoy the content of this show.
I certainly enjoyed it.
It's got bats.
It does have bats. That helped for me specifically.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad it did. That was part of the intended effect.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, besides the idea of kind of flirting back and forth and going through different endings of different stuff, I have another sort of question on this topic, and reincarnation really made me think about this. This idea of after you die, an ending happening, which I think even the restitution of all things, as it were, within Christianity, or any of the grand reapings, any of these big things where all the souls just sit there for eternity and then the end of the world happens and then they're sorted, lack a certain, well, I gotta say, je ne sais quoi. It really lacks something compared to many of the other kind of stories and ideas we have around the idea of living another life or having a future after the point at which we think things are an end. You know, like there's a coda, if you will.
Yeah.
By which...
Sorry, did you have a specific question?
I do, but if you want to talk about it broadly before I... Okay. By which I do want to ask Kavi, can you tell me a little bit about Destiny?
Yeah, sure. Are you taking used to ask me about video games I've played?
Yes!
Cool. Well, in Pokemon Violet, a professor uses the power of a a professor uses the power of a Pokemon in his imagination to summon Pokemon from the future. And then his son has to deal with that. No, in terms of cyclicality, like, it's funny you mentioned...
Is that the same professor who asks you what Chugi means?
No, that's a different guy.
Okay.
That's a headmaster who asks you what that means.
Gotcha.
Anyway, the actual thing I would say about Destiny is that, like, it's interesting that you bring it up because, like, a lot of... Destiny is both structurally and narratively cyclical, in the sense that, like, structurally you end up replaying a lot of the same stuff again with, like, slightly different, you know, variations on it. Not nearly as much variation as even in We Know the Devil, but there is a lot of that there. And then narratively, like, I remember this all the time. It sticks out in my head because the thing about Destiny is that in spite of everything that, like, is rough about its storytelling, it is just stunningly good at talking about PTSD and, like, dealing with traumatic experiences. I go back to this description on a spaceship of all things. That's just, like, a quote from this character named Eris Morn. I'm gonna pull it up, actually.
If you want to take a second, I can cut whatever happens interstitially here.
Yes, okay. Here, the ship is called Refashioned Shapes, and the quote is, "Recovery is a spiral, not a circle. You may return to the same patterns, but you will break free." And it's like, that's a wildly profound thing to say in a video game about shooting aliens.
Yeah. So, I mean, is it true?
I hope so.
About Destiny or about reality?
I hope so about reality. I'd like to think so about Destiny. I do think that in a lot of ways the themes of the story over the past couple of years have been about, like, coming back to the same questions over and over with new perspectives, new lives, new, like, you know. Briefly, for the listener who's unfamiliar, the reason that Destiny is relevant here is that the protagonists of Destiny, so-called Guardians, are resurrected warriors from the dead. And when they're resurrected, they have no memory of their first life. But after that first resurrection, they can come back, like, you know, almost as many times as they want. There's, like, some, you know, restrictions to make... They can't be killed permanently after in some ways, but most of the time they can just come back over and over and over again. But because they have no memories of their first life, there's always this really fascinating, like, you know, question of, like, where does the self of someone who has risen like this come from? And, like, are they the same person as they used to be? You know, I think a lot of people might be wondering, oh, well, what's it like if you come back, but you, like, you know, instead of being found out in the middle of nowhere, you come back, like, in a city and everyone knows who you were right before you died. And that is something that has come up with, like, a couple of different characters, right? Like, you know, there's this guy named Crow who, like, you know, he was a prince before he died, and everybody fucking knows that it was him, and, like, now he has to deal with the question of, like, how does he relate to the person who was his sister in his past life? How does he relate to this person who, like, he wronged in a deep way as the prince? Or you know, did he even wrong that person? Or was the prince separate from Crow? And Crow considers himself a different person, but then there's one of the other villains of the game, the Witch Queen, Savathun, who, like, makes a point of trying to recover her memories and become her old self. Like, she spends a lot of effort in, like, you know, doing that because it's important to her to reclaim her old self, and she seems to consider herself the same person. And so there is, like, a really fascinating, like, like, you know, I think it is very smart of Destiny, or at least to have like not come down with a single answer of like, oh, people are themselves from the old world, or no, people aren't themselves from the old world, because like, you have different people who think about this question differently, and there's no like cosmic answer, which is smart. One of the interesting things about Destiny is their categorical refusal to have the benevolent divine power ever speak at all. I think that's a very gutsy choice, and I hope they stick with it.
Is the benevolent divine power the egg thing that people talk about?
Yeah, it's called the Traveler.
Right. I was like, the Wanderer? That's not quite right. The Traveler.
Yeah.
Not to be confused with the Warmind Rasputin?
Not to be confused with the Warmind Rasputin, who is a different
Who's also
guy.
a big orb, though, right?
The Warmind Rasputin has a lot of orb-shaped satellites, but he has had different like places where he stored himself across time.
Is the Traveler the source of the ghosts?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Which, by the way, are responsible for resurrecting people into Guardians.
They're little robot buddies.
They are little robot buddies.
They look kind of like... Okay, at least my understanding of them is they look kind of like Wheatley from Portal.
That's not inaccurate, although they have like little spikes on the side of them. I think my favorite description I've ever seen is a sphere cradled in a broken cube.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Shall we tackle the game we came here to play?
No, I still have a few more questions. So, how do you think the ideas of Destiny, like, do they seem like they spring forth from a particularly Western Christian sort of myth making?
It's interesting that you bring that up, because the answer, I think, is yes and no. When Destiny first started, it had a very Manichaean view of light and darkness, right? Where the light, and I think it did a lot of work to justify, define these philosophies as very distinct. Where, it defined the philosophy of light as the philosophy of wanting to make space to preserve complexity and complex, life and complex behavior. And the philosophy of the darkness was this idea that, no, you should only have the simplest, strongest, most powerful thing. You should only have the only thing that has the right to exist in the world is the thing that can, carve that right out by violence. And if something is killed, then it didn't ever deserve to exist at all because it couldn't defend its position in the universe. So that's sort of grim logic being defined as the darkness, and in many ways by powers which claimed to be representative of the darkness. These would be I'm a being of darkness, I represent the darkness, and this is what the darkness believes. And so that was the watchword of Destiny for several years. And I was I think as a teenager, I thought those philosophical implications were interesting enough to be preserved. And as I got older, I kind of didn't know how to balance that with my impulse towards at the end of the day, this is a fairly Christian viewpoint. It's kind of simplistic. But recently we've started to complicate that sort of binary, right? Where it's Guardians have discovered the power to wield darkness without,
Right.
falling victim to that philosophy and channeling darkness in ways that don't immediately turn them into, giant monsters who want to kill everything in the galaxy that can't defend itself. And similarly, the Witch Queen, like I mentioned, who used to be of a people that worship the darkness, she was resurrected by a ghost with the powers of light, and she is not, she's not a guardian, but she is a light bearer, and she's risen, in the same way that guardians are. So we have come to a point now where it's we are starting to disentangle a lot of the philosophy of Destiny from that that very simplistic binary. I think it started in some ways very Christian, in influence, or at least it has a worldview that is mappable to Christianity. But they have done a lot of work to to split that up in ways that I think are believable. Like they've put in a lot of effort to like discuss the ways in which the perspective that claimed to be representative of the darkness might not be representative of the darkness, which allows them to like not just say, oh well, maybe sometimes it's good to kill everything that isn't, strong, while still saying, okay, well maybe this power doesn't have to be that. Like maybe the things that maybe the universe doesn't have to be as simplistically defined as the way it was defined to us in our early days. There are articulations of this change at varying levels of complexity in the lore, based on like, there's stuff as simple as, well, we know the darkness is not evil now, and there's stuff more complicated than that. Like it's not, do we think of winter as an inherently evil force? Do we think of this wintercraft and survival tactics as grim just because they happen to happen to take place in harsh circumstances? So there's varying levels of like articulation of this, but that's where Destiny has gone in recent years.
Okay, so I just want to dig into this just a little bit more. Because I'm thinking about like knowledge of the devil. I'm thinking about the devil as representative of like an antagonistic or adversarial force. And especially thinking about only learning about that through a text and structural system of like politics and power that claims to represent objectively, but acts as propaganda for like one particular side, if there even is such a binary. And so is there anything that really characterizes the darkness within Destiny, or I suppose Destiny 2 at this point, right? That we can think of as characterizing the darkness outside of that like culling sort of idea?
Yeah. Hard and fast is hard to say because we don't get a lot of objective answers. There is a really good, this is in-universe exegesis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But one of the Guardians has like like the foremost scholar of all Guardians, and like her name is Ikora, and she has an exegesis of light and darkness that goes something like, light and dark are sort of like two halves of ways to think about memory, whereas light is the power of eternal grace and the power of eternal forgiveness, and darkness is the power of memory and of remembering and not making the same mistakes over and over again. So like, if Guardians are resurrected in the light, then them being resurrected without memories of their first lives gives them this kind of like almost a blank slate, right? Like they don't have to be bogged down by the scars of their old lives. They don't have to be bogged down by these old traumas and like old things that might have made them like less crueler or more vindictive or more violent. And I don't know how much that actually worked, but it is like you can see how that philosophical idea might come to be in the light, which is something that is like this choice of grace, this choice of forgiveness, even in an unreasonable way, in a way that doesn't make sense. But you can't be pure light because you can't forgive everything without ever remembering how you were hurt, or else you will get hurt in the same way over and over and over again until it kills you.
Which is a kind of grace.
Which is a kind of grace, but perhaps not a healthy one.
I agree.
And so, tempering these forces against each other allows you to find the grace when you need it and come to forgive violence and like pain and trauma, even if it doesn't really make like quote unquote rational sense to do so, without just sort of like infinitely throwing yourself off into like with enough restraint to avoid throwing yourself off the precipice of eternal naivety, I suppose I could call it.
So one question I would have then is, if Savathûn is like villainous and light, but also reaches back into her former self and assumes a continuity of self, right?
Yeah.
Is that contradictory in a way?
Possibly, but I mean, this is part of the paradox of the traveler's silence, right? Which is that, like, we get a lot of exegeses of light and darkness from every character, except, like, we get them from characters who wield the light, and we get them from characters who wield the powers of darkness, and now we're getting them from characters who wield both forces. And we've gotten them from the character who like, we've gotten them from, quote unquote, the voice in the darkness, this being called the Witness, which is supposed to have been responsible for, like the apocalypse that predates Destiny's, like, story. But the Traveler never speaks. Like, Savathun, offers, like, 6 different interpretations. It's very funny, actually, because she leaves them as, like, posthumous messages. And then she was like, why did the Traveler bless us with the light? This is the truth. And then she has, like, 4 different answers, all of which are prefaced with that. Which is extremely funny for a god of cunning and lies to say. But one of them is like, the answer is we'll never know. Like, our god is a silent one. It will give us no answers, and we can never really know, like, why I managed to get away with it. I gambled that I would, and I was resurrected. And when I was resurrected, I gambled that I'd want to recover my memories, and I did. But I can't really know that, like, you can't know, I can't know, none of us can know why it is that we count as, that we are just as worthy as you are of the light, especially given that we've, been adherents of this universal culling philosophy for so long.
And that we take guns around and shoot things.
Yes.
The way that I, in, like, contemporary American Christianity, am familiar with the pronunciation of the word, by the way, is exegesis, which I know mostly is a partner to eisegesis, which I know because it's the shorthand for remembering that is I see Jesus. Because the act of eisegesis is often, like, looking into something and then being like, oh, but what that actually refers to is Jesus.
Yeah, I was gonna make a joke about something. I was like, eisegesis is when something is the same shape as Jesus and can stand in for him.
Sure, yeah, call it the Logos, right? One of the, like, fundamental foundational bedrocks of New Testament ideas, which I guess the closest comparison I would have would be Destiny 2. The beginning of the non-synoptic gospel, John, is John 1:1, which I don't expect you to know. But it would be very, it'd be very believable, which is to say, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, is the common English translation. And I've spilled plenty of ink on this. I've done a PowerPoint for a PowerPoint party on this. You'll forgive me briefly, I hope. Which is to say that the actual thing it says is, in the beginning is the Logos, and then what participles and prepositions we use to append to that Logos depend on what your opinion on what the Logos is. Ubiquitously growing up, every single person in every church community I was a part of, if you asked them to say, oh, John 1:1, they'd be like, right. In the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And they say, that's Jesus. It's also the Bible, but it's Jesus. Jesus is the Word more than the Bible is, because Jesus was there at the very beginning. And some people will be like, also this Bible that I hold in my hands was there at the very beginning, because, biblical literalism and, like, biblical, like, perfectionism. And I suppose in this case, biblical eternalism. And so often I have this question of, like, well, wait a minute. There's a few leaps that we're jumping to there, both in the assumption and assertion, which I could believe that, hey, this is just part of our teaching, that when we say Word, we mean Jesus, even though we don't really use that shorthand elsewhere in discussing Jesus Christ. And I do think logos is a fascinating idea, the ology of it all, right?
Okay.
My take, of course, is that the correct translation of the back half of that sentence is that the word was as God was, which is a different thing than saying the word was God. And we get into ideas of divines in these ideas. But that's my logos. Is there a logos in Destiny?
There are many competing logoses in Destiny, I think.
Is there a capital L, like proper name, italics, logos, like a big ship? Or like, hi, I'm Logos, the darkness champion.
Nobody named logos.
Okay. It's a common sci-fi thing, I think.
Yes, that's fair. No. There might be a gun that's called Logos.
I want to say... So, the main ship in The Matrix is the Nebuchadnezzar, right? And I want to say one of the ships in the second Matrix.
No guns called Logos. They should get on that.
The Logos, that's all. It's a shotgun that does plus 20 damage to, I don't know, arthropods. Bane of Arthropods, of course, being one of the enchantments in Minecraft, which does stray a little bit further from the point and from the idea. I've always wanted to have a chance to talk about grace, and so since we got on the topic, I'd like to talk about it very briefly. But it seems like you already really fundamentally understand almost everything I would be saying about grace, which is the idea that it is something that is so, like, thoroughly beyond typical and natural humanity that, like, grace is explicitly forgiveness you don't deserve.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting to think about, as we think about the divine grace and her candidate Vicuna and stuff like that.
There's an interesting contrast between your phrasing and mine, which is I said grace that doesn't make sense. Or rather, forgiveness that doesn't make rational sense. And you said forgiveness that the other person doesn't deserve.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the interesting moral difference there to me is the idea that, like, this is located in predictions about the future versus like judgments about the in the sense of, like, and I think this is true even in the lore where this is articulated in Destiny, but it's certainly true for the way I think about forgiveness. Like, this is a question really of, like, what are you willing to gamble the future on? Like, are you willing to gamble that if you enact this forgiveness that you won't be hurt again, or no? And it's interesting to me to think about the question of, like, deserving, because the only way I would think about deserving is, like, I think of, for someone to be deserving of forgiveness, in my mind, means that they are deserving of trust that the mistake won't be repeated. Or that at least something will happen to address the mistake. But the idea of, like, grace as being undeserved, like, I know enough about, like, the way that this has been articulated by Christians to say that, like, there is this deep sense of, like, human unworthiness for like, anything good to happen to us in Christianity. That is, like, I think that is a noticeable difference between the way they think about forgiveness in Christian, like, theology and the way that forgiveness is thought about in many other philosophies. I don't know how much of, like, I don't know how many other, like, explicit religions have the same framing that Christianity has and how many don't. But it does interest me that, like, there's a real concern with justice as this, like, thing that is in the universe and that you can measure every person against and decide whether they are deserving. And, like, the pragmatic sort of grace that I think is articulated in at least my own personal philosophy and in, I think, a lot of sci-fi works, but certainly in the one we happen to be thinking about and comparing to We Know the Devil right now.
I think there's a third axis that I'd like to introduce to the concept as well, which is a differential of power as being part of the situation.
Oh, that's super true.
Which is to say, grace as something almost explicitly done from the powerful to the powerless, or at least, like, if I'm doing an act of grace to you, like, I'm not saying this is, I'm just using I and you as fake pronouns in this sentence. If I'm doing an act of grace to you, like, you might have power over other things, but you have no power over me.
Yeah.
And so I have nothing to benefit by offering you this forgiveness, offering you this grace, because I have no need of you or your positivity or your negativity or anything like that. And so following that, like, power differential as also part of the, like, dessert and the other things, because it's like, well, of course, we don't deserve big and powerful things to take care of us in any particular way. But I think that might also be a thought trap connected to exactly what you were just talking about, which is the very idea that if something is big enough and powerful enough, well, why would it care about you?
And on that note, we know the devil.
Yeah, it is certain. It is absolutely certain. It is certain that the devil is already here. And the question then is, of course, is the devil such an exaggerated power compared to us that something like grace could be back on the menu, be back in the discussion? Absent God's grace, do we have any sort of grace towards each other? Is there anything outside of God that could offer us the grace? I have a few more questions. If you haven't seen the bit yet, So one of the comments on the previous video suggested a different idea of being the core of Jupiter's tragedy. It's one I wanted to get your feedback on.
Oh, I haven't seen this.
Which is the idea that earnest belief can itself be like a tragedy, can be the particularly tragic thing. And this is not how the commenter would have worded it, but like the way I would word it based on the things that I've like experienced, and especially in talking to and working with, you know, people in my own family and that sort of thing, the idea that earnest belief can itself be a like traumatic and abusive like visitation on someone if the thing that you are earnestly believing is like scary enough and bad enough. Which the primary incidents I would say here is just like, frankly speaking, the idea of hell. Like taking a child and being like, hey, by the way, many people that you know, even people you care about, and very likely you, unless you do the right thing, are going to be tortured forever. Like imagine the worst torture imaginable. Now imagine that for the rest of all time with no escape. And like oftentimes in quite vivid and violent detail. And we take that as so commonplace, but that can be an incident of trauma that's not like just that moment, but because it's the not just somebody told you a violent thing and that idea was violent, but somebody inculcated a belief in you of your kind of like existence on the trolley tracks heading in that direction, and that so many things in your life would need to be done specifically to like persevere in not going in that direction and not going into that destination. And then like the divorce between the way you are able to correspond with the world and like the way other people correspond with the world, much less the way the world actually is, caused by this like belief that perpetuates itself in kind of isolating you in that way.
Yeah. I think the reason I didn't necessarily, like, I don't think that that's not true for Jupiter, but I think it's true for all of them. Maybe Neptune the least, but, like, I don't think Venus thinks she's going to heaven. You know what I mean? And I don't think any of them are, like, it wouldn't have stood out to me as something that, like, Jupiter sincerely believes in Because, like, the thing is, Neptune, as the one who most sees through this, is still, like, kind of in it, even if she's halfway out. Like, you know,
halfway out isn't all the way out.
no, it certainly is not, right? Like, I think about it this way. Neptune has two roots where she's not the devil, and she purifies the devil out of one of the other kids. The first one is one of them is Jupiter, and Jupiter says, I swear to God, I will make you kick this thing out of me if you won't do it on your own. So, like, fine, whatever. But, like, Neptune does that to Venus, too, without Venus asking for it. And I think Venus might have been the kind of person to ask for it if that route had gone slightly differently. Maybe not. Who knows? But Neptune is not so far detached from this entire, like... The fact that Neptune can see the artifice of all this does not mean that she is free of it.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, insofar as there is... Insofar as, like, you talk about the inculcation, but that inculcation doesn't just happen because someone tells you stuff. Like, it sucks. And I know this because I had to, like, come to terms with the idea that many people in this country believe that I was going to hell. But what I don't have, that I think these kids have, and that I think you might have had as well, is the constant reinforcement, like, of punishment that, like, happens in your life, right? Like, I have known for most of my life that many people believe that I will be going to hell, and that, like, I've seen people say this, for my whole life. But I don't face consequences in my life based on my behaviors and whether they conform to Christian, like, social, norms, right? Whereas with these kids, they do, right? It's like, it's not just the idea of hell as some place you're going after. It is the constant creation of hell on Earth as a consequence for deviation from the norm. And, like, that is the thing that I think all of them are scared of. And I think Jupiter is especially scared of it because she feels that there is nothing... I think Jupiter is stuck in this world where she believes it's within her capacity to get out. If someone else, if she was if someone else, if Jupiter could hand off her body to someone else, then that person could go to heaven and in her stead, if that makes sense. I don't think Venus. I have
felt that exact idea. To be fair, that like specific sentiment, I was like, holy shit, that's a thought that I've had in my life. Sorry, go on about Venus.
I don't think Venus. No, there wasn't anything to. I don't think Venus thinks similarly. I think Venus does not necessarily like. I mean, I couldn't know, but I don't think Venus is like. Or worse yet, Venus has a moral commitment to behaving the way she thinks is right, regardless of what the consequences will be. She says, I'm not going to be like. I mean, she doesn't say it in so many words, but she says, I don't care if it gets me hurt. I am not going to be masculine, right? Like. Literally, she's like, better to rule in hell. And by rule in hell, I mean be a halfway decent person than to serve in heaven. Which is to say, be the things that, the Christians around her want her to be. Jupiter, I think, still thinks, Jupiter doesn't see the world that way, and she doesn't see, like, Jupiter doesn't have the confidence in her desires as being, like, worth fighting for against the norms of, like, the things she's taught to aspire to. And, like, we get Jupiter's characterization as someone who almost gets it every time, right? Like, she is so close in a way that Neptune doesn't try to be and Venus refuses to be. And so I think it has to sting that much more for her that she can't ever, like, cross that final step. I think in her heart because she doesn't want to, but, like, feels as though it is her obligation to.
Yeah. You had mentioned the idea of, like, making hell on Earth.
Yeah.
But in, like, rarely... The wild thing about all of this, listener at home, if you've probably picked up on this a long time ago, the act of making the show is not just very, very funny, but it's like... it's almost like it's philosophical in a therapeutic way. It's having somebody actually like just point out an obvious flaw in something that like you've continued, because here's the thing. Neptune's like halfway out, right?
Yeah.
But that's not all the way out. I don't know that I'm all the way out.
I don't know that you are either. Which, to be clear, like, one of the weird things, one of the weird things about growing up as, like, a religious minority specifically, in addition to being an ethnic minority, is, like, as I've gotten older, a lot of my experience with white trans girls has been like, oh, you grew up in a cult. And, like, that is true for, like, way more white trans girls than I ever realized when I was, like, fresh out of, like, you know, when I was, like, a month on E or whatever. Like, it is so, like it really it is this really intense shift in perspective to realize that in many ways, things that are, like, you know, things and ways of looking in the world that are obvious to you are, like, things that other people have arrived at, like, because they have been fighting literally years, like, multiple decades in some cases, of, like, active indoctrination.
Mhm.
And it's, like, you know, I will also say that, like, this isn't necessarily, like, I always softball them, because sometimes then you have to hear the other side of that, and it sucks, and, my patience, much as I wish it might be otherwise, is not infinite. But, like, you know, even when, in both in the cases where it is and isn't, it is always, like, it takes a real, like, readjustment to recall that, like, there is something, like, and you know, I don't like it when people clown too much on American culture as this thing that's, like, fundamentally evil. Not because I have this great fondness for American, like, the American state or the American people, but because I don't think that's a productive or useful way of, like, looking at the world. And because I don't believe that, like, you know, just because a culture is responsible for some oppressive stuff, or even many oppressive things, that you should start taking that essentialist approach of, like, well, there's nothing here that's worth preserving.
You're taking a materialist point of view.
Yes. But I think but in spite of that, like, there is something deeply poisonous about American evangelism. And it is it takes such a mental readjustment to recall that, like, that poison is in like a significantly larger part of, like, the, like, you know, American, like, trans feminine, like, community, or broader than that, the American trans feminine, and maybe even just trans writ large population.
I think I would extend that trans writ large.
Yeah. Queer writ large, even. Population. Sure. That is, like, it people will be deprogramming this shit for years, and it's so many more years than I remember. And I'm sure I have plenty of my own stuff in that, but, like, there's a degree of... I think one of the things that has been interesting about my friendship, like, as I have gotten to know more, like, white queer people, and mostly just more white people in general compared to, like, my childhood, even as a child with largely Asian friends, I feel like I was much more aware of the contrast between what I had grown up with and what the norms around me were than I think a lot of people who grew up in an American culture, like, especially white Americans, you know, realize about their own culture. Like, and this will come up in here, like, to these kids, like, the Midwest is the planet. Like, it may as well be the entire world. And it's like, I have never lived like that because I've been to other countries. Like, I've been literally on the other side of the world because that's where my family is from. I've been to visit them. And, like, it is that lack of perspective, like, no, I'll commit to that. That lack of perspective, like, takes some getting used to, and takes some, like, it's something I have to remember about other people.
Yeah. So I have something to admit on this general topic.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, so yesterday we had a transformer blow up. Big boom, not nearly as loud as the sonic booms near where I grew up, but still, somewhat deafening, somewhat surprising. And our power was out. And after a hour or two, we did get a response and everything that this is going to be a multi-day outage. This is a stressful time for that to happen in my life, I'm going to be honest. And it is frightening to experience, and like I feel so pampered saying this. It is frightening to experience the out of nowhere you've got no power. Out of nowhere you've got no backup for things. Out of nowhere you've got no internet. You've got no connection. And potentially if you're going to be stretching that into multiple days, you have to figure out your food situation. You have to figure out how you're going to deal with all of the things that need to be thrown out. Now, you've got to deal with the fact that your phone has a battery now, but it won't forever. And like the rationing that immediately starts happening. And there's also just the anxiety of the fact that, I mean, I don't talk about it a lot, but my eyesight is getting progressively worse over time. And I'm very thankful that we know the devil is extremely easy to read, even if I've like significantly doubled vision, because it's only ever one line of text simple on the screen. But as you get into low light situations, as you're trying to do stuff with like fading daylight, as you're trying to do things by candlelight, my eyesight goes to like almost nothing, which is not how it used to be. It's kind of terrifying. And so I did something yesterday that I'm a little bit ashamed of, but is like relevant to this topic, of course. Are you familiar with the idea that there are no atheists in a foxhole?
Yes.
Which is to say, or at least the way I've always felt this, since I first really tried to break myself of the habit of praying, which, as I've talked about before, is something I used to do so often. I used to do in response to so many things, in anticipation of things. I was trying so many different ways and so many different things that was my response to things. And so when I tried to break myself of the habit, I realized that I could do that on a daily basis, but then when something really terrifying would happen, I would fall back into it. And I was like, no, I need to not have this be something I lean on in dangerous or traumatic times, or else it doesn't count. Or else it like, if I'm still gonna pray when I'm like really scared about something, then like all the other work I'm doing doesn't count, right? Which
I don't know that I agree with that, but I understand that it's what you thought.
I sometimes I worry that there's a little bit of like Eridan in this space.
Right.
A little bit of the like, no, that's not very scientific of me. Therefore, like the science god is going to judge me. But so yesterday I prayed for the first time in many years. And like, I felt the kind of trepidation one feels when one goes back to a like old habit or addiction, as well as the like, kind of peace and rush that comes also from that sort of like weird communication. I didn't get any visions this time, but like, I don't know. I think the last time I prayed, again, to the like Christian God, not to, somebody else like Perennial, who answers prayers, but like in a really positive way and doesn't make me feel bad about it. Like the last time I prayed a few years ago, that might be 6 or 7 years ago at this point. That might be like 2017 or 2018 or whatever. Like I got a vision and everything, but this time I didn't. But I was praying specifically for a thing, and we were looking at this multi-day outage. And by this morning, we got our power back. And I feel especially like, oh, whoops, dang, geez, guilty about this, because I did the thing and I got the thing I wanted out of it. which is extremely bad for trying not to end up in that habit. But I also feel like a sort of guilt, as though the experience of asking for help to the numinous other in one's time of like anxiety or need as a like peace-seeking ritual, I'm like, well, but if I do that, then I'm a Christian and am like responsible for all of the like crimes and malfeasance and like problems of Christianity writ large, writ history.
I think that's more. I think that itself is a more Christian thing to think than the idea that, oh God, I wish God could help me.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are a lot of people of many faiths who have thought to themselves, I wish God would help me out now. I think it. Yeah, sorry, I didn't necessarily have a conclusion there. I just wanted to say, no, I don't think that's true. I don't think you bear the weight of every crusade on your shoulders.
Similar to one of my favorite bits so far in this series, where I mention the act of voluntarily going to church, and I go, the listener can judge me. You know, I could be damned for this. Similarly, I feel this sort of like, oh, well, I've done this like malfeasance. I've done this objectively evil thing, and like a damnation awaits me, but it's a different one. It's a more like rational, scientific damnation. I'm
gonna like make you read a book of Buddhist philosophy at this point.
Sure, you know, I would love to. Or sorry, yes, please make me do that. I don't know how this works. All right. I think that's most of the ideas that we have about the devil and knowledge there too.
Yeah. I've tried to start this like 3 times, partly because I've been buzzing to get started. Like
yeah, we should say, A, it's been a long time since we recorded. Sorry, B, I'm cutting off copy. C, to the listener at home, we're starting the true ending right now.
Yep. I've been buzzing for this because we had to miss a week, and also every single time you've expressed any emotion about this game, I'm like, Juliet, I cannot wait for you to see the true ending. You will understand so much more. Anyway, let's do it.
Yeah, I'm so excited to start this off. Do I need to do like, because I've heard that you can't get the true ending even if you balance everything.
I think you can do it as a new game and you should be okay.
Okay. Ready? Listener at home, take a deep breath. Exhale. New game.
To know the devil.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Devil We Know. I've been Juliet. You can find me at Mousewife Games on itchy.io and YouTube, like you see here, and find my writings at Folly on Co-host.
I'm Kavitha. I'm your girl KV on both Itch and Co-host, and it has been fun to know the devil.
Catch us next time on The Devil We Know.